Foundational Microeconomics. Our earlier videos established a perception of the macroeconomy as a sentient creature with a mind of its own. We view Homo sapiens' halting attempts at civilization as primate simulacra of the societal genius we see perfected in the naturally occurring anarcho-capitalism of the insect superorganisms. This stance has us asserting that the material substrate of a civilization is most usefully presumed to function on operational premises that are indifferent to the activities of its individual citizens. SF Econ thus opposes more commonly held convictions, alleging that economic causation proceeds upward from human action to create behaviors we observe in the economic whole. Our opposition generally sources modern economic theory in Adam Smith's perambulations around Edinburgh, where he discovered the neoclassical axiom of individualism in the psyches of his butcher, his brewer, and his baker. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Having found its Homo Economicus in Smith's tradesman, neoclassicism had then only to invoke the truism that the whole must equal the sum of its parts in order to install marginalism as the macroeconomy's control mechanism. This line of reasoning finds its most ardent expressions among libertarian practitioners of the Austrian school. Austrian school economics teaches that we should begin to study macroeconomics by studying microeconomics. Macroeconomics can be explained only as the outcome of microeconomics. What an individual does in a private property legal order can be explained in terms of economic theory, profit and loss. What the entire economy does can also be explained in terms of individual profit and loss. Any system of macroeconomics whose defenders assert its autonomy from microeconomics is an illusion. Cause and effect in economic theory begin with individual decision-making. Though seldom noted, this notion of microphenomena being ruled by profit and loss began running into trouble a half-century before Dr. North had his say on this matter. Whether assessed by place of birth, university attended, scholarly output, or direct association with Mises himself, there could never be a more Austrian economist than Fritz Machlup. But even his repute among the Austrians was severely diminished when his investigations of ongoing business praxis failed to discover marginalism doing much of anything to explain the operating practices of actual firms. His findings led him to demote marginalism into competition with other theories of the firm, and to equivocate these theories' mutual antagonism in terms of managers' comfort with satisficing behaviors. Satisficing being a terminological innovation that apparently means whatever it takes to make my theory work. These hesitations have entered more and more into economic thought through the rise of the several heterodox schools. One avenue of their assault on mainstream neoclassicism is their demand that, like Bigfoot, an actual specimen of economic man be produced prior to discussions of this creature's behavior. The unspoken assertion here being that Homo Economicus does not exist, and thus there is no observable basis for the axiomatic individualism at the center of neoclassical causation. Cultural anthropologist David Graeber's career was devoted to examining how different tribes actually do create the cultural pheromones that control their microeconomic activities. In the book summing up his lifetime of field work, he reports that his efforts to capture an economic man have been to no avail. To the contrary, Graeber consistently rediscovers some operational expression of moral sentiments described by Adam Smith long before his discourse on the wealth of nations. How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. and Graeber is not at all reticent in conveying these findings to economic science. Those branches of social theory that make the greatest claims to scientific status, rational choice theory for instance, start from the same assumptions about human psychology that economists do: that human beings are best viewed as self-interested actors, calculating how to get the best terms possible out of any situation, the most profit or pleasure or happiness for the least sacrifice or investment. Curious, considering experimental psychologists have demonstrated over and over again that these assumptions simply are not true. Such findings were emphatically stamped on economic science in 2002, when Princeton behavioralist Daniel Kahneman was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for successfully challenging the prevailing assumption of human rationality in material affairs. Finding no immediate prospect for economics and psychology sharing a common theory of human behavior, Professor Kahneman flatly asserts that the standard assumptions about the economic agent are in economic theory for the same reason as the equilibration discussed in our video on that topic. That is, they allow for tractable analysis. This imperative that analysis must be done irrespective of ascertainable fact was established long ago by Mises himself, especially in his habit of prefacing his economics with a few hundred pages on humane praxis. Praxeology is a theoretical and systematic, not a historical science. Its scope is human action as such, irrespective of all environmental, accidental, and individual circumstances of the concrete acts. Its cognition is purely formal and general, without reference to the material content and the particular features of the actual case. It aims at knowledge valid for all instances in which the conditions exactly correspond to those implied in its assumptions and inferences. Its statements and propositions are not derived from experience. They are, like those of logic and mathematics, a priori. They are not subject to verification or falsification on the ground of experience and facts. But are there any conditions that correspond even vaguely to those implied in the assumptions and inferences of the economic schools originating in marginalism? All scientific, observable, and repeatable analyses upon actual businesses and on living, breathing people says no. And the neoclassical and Austrian schools' only responses to date merely echo the Talmudism of Erasmus Darwin in his reaction to the empiricism of his younger brother Charles. A priori reasoning is so entirely satisfactory to me that if the facts won't fit in, why so much the worse for the facts. SF Econ sits squarely in this crossfire between economics' neoclassical mainstream and its heterodox antagonists. Though we appreciate and wish to advance heterodoxy's insistence that economics become an empirical, observational science in the Western tradition, we nonetheless source our causality in the axiomatic individualism that justifies assertions of marginal revenues always approaching marginal costs. Our way out of this conundrum requires that both of our adversaries eventually grant us each of 2 points. 1. Economics' reliance on the truism that the whole must equal the sum of its parts is irrelevant. And 2. Working specimens of Homo Economicus can be observed if you know where to look. On point 1, it must be ceded immediately that the whole can have no definition other than the sum of its parts. But the issue for economics is not what is, but what behaves. The relevant fact here is that there are no dynamic systems in which the behavior of the whole in any way resembles the behavior of any of its parts. If economics requires some sort of confirmation from the behavioral sciences on this point, let us put forward behavioralism's preeminent specimen, Rattus norvegicus. An albino Norway rat is composed of approximately the same number of living cells as there are people participating in the global economy. Living things can be characterized by how they move, feed, and reproduce. Living cells do not move outside the body of which they are a part, unless it is to die. Cells are nourished by a circulatory system. Cells reproduce by mitosis. Rattus norvegicus, by contrast, is a quadruped with a digestive system and reproduces sexually. A person is a biped with a digestive system and reproduces sexually. The economy, by contrast, is a distribution of physical assets among the processes by which new assets are produced. Foundational microeconomics only continues a habit of medieval thought. The scholastic mind longed for godlike truth in which the universe might be viewed as unified, in which any truth, to be true, had to be operative in application to phenomena viewed at any level of abstraction. Modern science outside of economics has long contented itself with creating formal metaphors that are valid in certain degrees for certain applications. They accept that observations taken by instruments having different lengths of focus will reveal different phenomena requiring their specific, unique explanatory models. For example, Schrödinger's wave equation explains the periodic chart of elements, but it has no grasp of the Newtonian universe that is familiar to us, and Newton's mechanics have no application in the subatomic world. On point 2, we begin by conceding the absence of orthodoxy's economic man among the subjects of behavioral studies, who are usually college sophomores. But such a finding might be explained most simply by economic man's comparative rarity among the population. It is not difficult to imagine these studies being productive if conducted on Wall Street or in the City of London, where a minute labor specialties placements of capital operate to create overall efficiency in the macroeconomic system. Accepting that capitalism is a means for coordinating a great many labor specialties, with each having a personality of its own, it should not be difficult to project collectives of all the securities analysts specializing in a given sector into the role of Homo Economicus. These people are preoccupied by gain. Their placements of capital among firms in their sectors are undertaken for the sake of maximal returns. They are often personally hedonistic, and they have proprietary knowledge of the firms in their sectors because they are inevitably among the firm's directors. Thus, neoclassical causality does not by any means require that everyone be his own specimen of economic man, only that such creatures exist in the comparatively small numbers required at those places where general economic optimality can be created. So our view of neoclassicism has two wrongs adding up to a right. It was, in the first instance, empirically wrong to project marginalism onto the affairs of microeconomic actors. And it was then philosophically wrong to expect that the macroeconomy's behaviors must be a simple multiple of the micro-behaviors. SF Econ offers nothing in the way of microeconomics. Our subject is the macroeconomy, which we examine as if it were a sentient being whose motives are wholly its own. And, having concluded that the notion of a general tendency toward optimality has no special application in the affairs of people or their local business enterprises, we feel free to adopt the now orphaned mathematics of marginalism to use in navigating around our macroeconomic man's locus of technical indifference.